So 3 layers in Scenic. You've got logical UI, you have a viewport that makes sense of multiple pieces of UI. So when you click on somewhere in the screen, it does all the matrix transformations, figures out what actually got clicked on. Interestingly, when you look at a piece of UI in Scenic, you'll see a bunch of buttons. Each one of those buttons is a gen server in Elixir. And each one of those buttons thinks that it's in the upper left-hand corner of the screen with no scaling and no rotation. But you can apply matrices to them in whatever parent it is, so you can move them around, you can scale them, you can rotate them. But when the click comes in, it's always, the coordinates are always transformed back into the local space. So you always are in the upper left-hand corner. You just don't have to, makes it easy. You don't have to worry about that stuff. So the viewport manages that stuff and makes sense of it, makes it easy to build the logical UI. The layer below it is the drivers. The driver takes the normalized view of the world from the viewport and then figures out how to actually draw it. And what I found in .11 was the more drivers I was writing, I was repeating myself constantly. You take a graph and you have to traverse the graph, which is hierarchical, and output a linear string of draw commands. Right? Erase the screen, draw a circle here, draw a square there, put some text here. You end up with a very linear set of commands that could be, that once you've built that linear set, you can draw it very quickly. But that each driver ended up having the same code over and over and over to build that linear set of commands. So the biggest change in .11 was to take that concept, how do you build that linear thing, and bring it up into the viewport. So we can just write it once, and that makes the drivers extremely simple. So when you look at .11, the big new module in it is the script. And that's literally what it is. It's a script is a linear set of drawing commands. And if you want a mental model for it, look at the Canvas API for the web. And if you look at the Canvas API, there's almost a one-to-one mapping of script commands in Scenic to Canvas API calls. So now the local renderer, what it does is it accepts this linear set of commands, and it's got a very fast direct to OpenGL little rendering engine that effectively, does like a script API call. It does like similar things to the Canvas API and renders it out locally on your little touchscreen attached to your device. But now I can also take that linear set of commands and I can package it up into a binary, ship it out over the internet, pass it down to a web browser where I've got this big, long JavaScript thing I wrote that then parses it out and literally calls the Canvas API. Right, so now I can take a piece of UI and I can render it locally on a screen, and I can take the exact same Scenic UI and I can render it 2,000 miles away in a web browser. You have latency, so that can make things hard. But it's finally starting to get to where I really wanted it to go, where you have a UI you can write once. I can render it locally. I can, like on a nerd's machine, I can render it on my Mac. I can render it on Windows. I can render it in Linux. I can send it out to a web server, which is running Phoenix, by the way, and hook up a socket and get a channel hooked up, and then I can relay it down to a web browser, and it's the exact same UI. You write it once, and it looks exactly the same everywhere. And there's no open ports on the device. The device goes to the web server, not the other way around. So my device has a known server, and I can key it to that. So it's got cryptographic keys, and I know I'm talking to a known source. And then that web server can proxy other users hitting that UI. Right, and that's all running now, and it's exciting. And taking the script, that scripting thing, or in like gaming world, it's almost a command buffer. A command buffer going down to a graphics card is just a list of commands. Right, so this script is at primitives like draw a rounded rectangle. Well, how do you draw the rounded rectangle? That's up to the renderer. Right, in the local driver, that means build a bunch of triangles that define that arc in the corner, and then a straight line, 2 triangles to do the square in the middle, a bunch of triangles to do the next little corner. In the web, it's just a call It's a simple set of calls to Canvas APIs. Right, so it really depends on what's driver and what's the actual rendering mechanism. But that script, thinking through what that script, that linear list of commands was really the bulk, the heart of what the .11 release is. There's a bunch of other stuff in there too. I don't even remember, but that was the motivator, was lifting up that, taking the heavy work out of all the drivers, standardizing it, moving it up into the viewport, and now drivers get tremendously simpler.
That's all you've been doing? That's it?
So to make sure that I understand correctly, when you talked about that scene, that top layer, it has the listeners in it. So a keyboard event would be listened for by the scene, whereas the mouse needs to be listened or adapted to by the viewport because it also needs to know where things are rendered to know where that mouse is. Am I getting that right?
Well, kind of. So a keyboard event, a mouse event, any of that stuff, all the communication comes in through a driver. Like if I'm in a web page 2,000 miles away and I click on a piece of UI, well, that web page received a click or it received some typing and it has to package it up and send it back over the internet to the server, which relays it back to the machine, which is picked up by a driver. And then that driver sends a standardized input message up to the viewport. The viewport figures out, is this something that should go to a piece of your scene, to this piece of Scenic UI or that piece of Scenic UI, and then through the magic of Erlang, it puts a message in the right gen server. Right? Then your UI wakes up because, hey, it's just a gen server and you just received a message, and that message is mouse click here. You figure out what to do with it from there. Right? Now, mouse clicks are harder than a keyboard input because a mouse click, you have to transform all your coordinate spaces. A keyboard click could go to all of them. It could go to just one. That's where, when you look at the input mechanism, you'll see API calls on the viewport that are like, what is it? You've got capture. You've got, you can capture a piece of input. You can, oh crap. What was the other one? You can request input and you can capture input. If you've requested input that says, hey, if there's a keyboard press that happens, tell me about it. But I'm not going to be greedy. If anyone else has requested it, they get to hear it too. But like a text field, that wants to be greedy. I'm typing in a text field, so it captures the input. So now if I've captured the input and someone types in the keyboard, only I get it, and it's not related to all the other scenes that have only requested. Right, so it's up to the viewport to do that kind of management. And that keeps your scenes really simple. So you say, hey, I'm going to request this, or I'm going to capture that. And then you start receiving messages when those events happen. After that, what you do is you update your graph, you push it to the viewport. When you push it to the viewport, that starts a chain of events which automatically compiles scripts based on your graph, sends them down to the driver. The driver does whatever it needs to do, render it locally or send it out over the internet.
Thank you.
So yeah,
I've got a quick question about the scripts or the command buffer. And I realize this probably isn't part of it yet, but on the modern JavaScript front-end scene, there's this whole idea of like DOM diffing and trying to reduce the amount of packets going over the wire. Mm-hmm. With the scripts or the command buffer, is it just like sending the whole frame every time, or is there any way that it's making that more efficient?
Great question. I have the advantage of the different pieces of UI. Like each button that you put out it's called a component in Scenic Land. Each one of those is a different gen server. Each one of those manages its own graph. So like a button with a rounded rect and a piece of text inside is its own graph. And that graph becomes a script. And if you look under the covers in the viewport manages an ETS table, right? Which means that it's really fast to read from. And when you write to the ETS table, that has to come into the viewport to maintain some control of it. That writes a row to the table, and then it sends a message to all the drivers. There might be one driver, there might be 20 drivers, you don't know. then they read very quickly from the ETS table and decide what to do with that thing. But the point is, it only sends the little script pieces that changed. Like I might have the thing I'm looking at could be 1,000 different scripts. I only send the one that changed.
That only applies to scripts, right?
Yes, it only applies to scripts. But remember, a graph, the graph is like a hierarchical thing, and there's inheritance and all that stuff. When you push a graph, what happens is that graph gets compiled into a script. And you don't put the graph doesn't go in the viewport. The script that is compiled from the graph goes in the viewport.
So it's all scripts all the way down.
It's all scripts all the way down. Once you push it, it's all scripts. The graph is purely for logical UI reasons.
Cool. I think that's a huge selling point, that it's so efficient that way.
Yeah, I think so too. And then it also allows you to do things now where if I've got a complicated scene, let's say I want to do a little bit of animation, you could animate a part of a graph. Like the inefficient way to do it is I have a big graph and I'm going to animate one little piece of it. Well, Scenic doesn't really know. So if you're updating a huge graph and that's a huge script, it's going to send the whole thing. But you could break that into 2 graphs that refer to each other. One big static one and one teeny tiny one, which just does the rotation. Right. And you can start getting kind of clever then, because by the way, a scene, they've got that default graph for your scene. If you look at the API for push graph, the default, there's a second parameter at the end, which is the script ID, which is the idea of the thing you're pushing, the graph you're pushing. And it defaults to nil. I think it defaults to nil. And what that means is the ID of this graph, the name of this graph is just the same as the name of my scene. That's the 99% case is there's a one-to-one relationship between your graph and your scene. But that optional parameter is there. So you could pass in a different name. So a scene can easily manage more than one graph and have them refer to each other. So I got my big static one, and then I got my tiny little dynamic one. And then my updates over the wire are tiny. Joke on Boyd, everyone here is working on 1% of use cases. Yeah, me too.
Boyd, I had a question about like the canvas-based renderer. Are you planning to like open source that in the future?
That's a great question. Not at the moment. So I'll tell you, my goal with the canvas-based renderer, it lives in a server which is all about maintaining and sending updates to devices running the new OS.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So that's its current form that it lives in. I know the picture gets really complicated. It's like, oh, we got Scenic and we got all these pieces, but then you start talking about a new operating system that sits underneath it, right? So think of it like when you have a microkernel that's all about highly secure sandboxes, you have to have a way to update it. So this thing it's talking to a server in the cloud that has all the right signatures that can send updates to applications down. And while you have a connection to the device, the default is if you have Scenic UI on that device, then that's where it's being routed. So my first mission is I have to get that done.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a whole bunch of work. And at some point in the future, maybe, but for now, it's like that part is probably aimed at devices running the new OS. And I'll talk more about that come November.
Yeah, I think I'd be interested in that as well. Being able to also have checks at some point would probably be, and I know all of us are probably a little far away from this, but having checks to verify that what you've built and what you're shipping will work with the Canvas API is also probably super helpful to make sure that you're not shipping something that will completely break on the web.
Well, so this was like a big part of 0.11. If you take a look at the surface area of the primitives between 10 and 11, what you'll see is that a couple things went away. There were a couple of gradients that went away. They went away because they're not supported on Canvas. If you look at the path, a couple of subtle things in what you can do with the path primitive changed, because you can't do them on canvas. So today, all the primitives and everything you can do in the primitives is already in the set of things that I can render locally and I can render remotely. So you can't go outside of it. So you're pretty safe.
Even if you built a custom component, you couldn't build outside of it?
Well, the custom component still has to use the primitives.
Yeah, right.
So if you can express it in the primitives, then it can be drawn.
I don't appreciate you breaking something for all of us that we can't have fun and try to tell you that you have bigger problems on your hands, Boyd.
Yeah, that was really hard. If you do see a spot in the primitives where it can't be drawn in canvas, then I want to know. All right. Oh, now let's talk about path for a second. So in the past, let's say you wanted to do a chart, a graph, and you had like a line graph or something, you would build it by saying, here's a path object, and I'm going to string together a bunch of commands. In the past, that got handed down to your driver to do whatever. Today, that path object itself has its own little compiler, and it ends up just being a script command for each one of those lines in the path. But what I encourage is go into the checkbox component, which is part of .11. Go into checkbox. That little check mark, well, that's a static shape. So that is written in the checkbox component directly as a script. And that script has a name, and that would be the component that demonstrates here's a graph and here's a script, and they're both managed by the same gen server, and it pushes that check mark out with a second name and then refers to it. Right, so when you're checking the checkbox and it's coming in and out, you're just setting a visibility in a very, very small piece of script, and it's triggering a larger script as to whether or not it gets drawn or not. So that over the wire, it's very little data. That makes sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the scripts, by the way, are kind of a pain in the butt. They're a little hard to put together because you got to think in coordinate spaces and all that stuff.
I was just thinking I should rewrite some icons that I built for the whiteboard app. I built all of those icons with paths, and it was a miserable experience. I highly recommend none of you do it. But I built all those, and I'm realizing I should convert all of those to scripts until you said just now that it's not very fun. So I think that maybe I'll work off.
Well, I mean, it depends. Like the little icon for the check mark, it's totally appropriate to do it as a script. I had to kind of wrap my head around it. You can also, at compile time, using the compile time directives, you can actually have a graph, build it at compile time, and then the very last call you make is compile the script. And you'll actually get the script back. So there's different ways to do it. And then, Ben, you in particular, as we talk about tools that help people build things, this would be a great example of a tool that would help assemble scripts and just output the term.
I'm going to ask the annoying question that other people are probably thinking. What about SVG?
Oh, hey. I started looking at it. In theory, I don't think there's anything that would prevent someone from making an SVG component. It's almost like I think, no, how was I thinking about it? You should be able to make a primitive, an SVG primitive, which isn't really a primitive. So if you look at the primitive code, look at primitives, there's a new callback on primitive, which is compile yourself. So you take the data, each primitive is a little map, and one of the elements of the map is data, and it's up to each primitive to find what kind of data it is. Like a rounded rectangle has a width, a height, and a radius. It's a tuple with 3 numbers. Well, how do you draw that thing? Well, the compile yourself callback takes the piece of data and then calls the script API one after another to build up a little mini script and then hands it back during the compilation process. You should absolutely be able to make an SVG primitive where the data field is the SVG itself. The hard part is parsing it and translating that into script API calls. And I will not guarantee that that the script APIs would cover the full set of what you can do in an SVG. But a subset should be doable. And I wanted to play with it, but man, I don't have time. But yeah, it's doable. It should be doable. And I would love that.
Cool. Any last questions for Boyd before we move on to the Scenic project discussion section?
I guess my question is somewhat of a lead into that, which is, should I wait until .11 drops to get started learning Scenic, or is it okay to start learning now?
I would say you should just use the beta 0 of .11. It's actually pretty good.
Okay, where do I get access to, or like where is that?
So it's on Hex.
Okay,
it's on Hex, and you just when you do the depths line, you just have to specify that it's the .11 beta.
Thank you,
Roland. I would also highly encourage that, because there's a lot of changes between 10 and 11 that
I was reading the GitHub README. I understood.
Yeah,
that was the case.
Because from experience, if you build too much in 10 and build it in certain ways, you're just going to wreck yourself when you move over to 11. So you should just start with that.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Cool. So I think we're ready to move on to the next section. Who has a project that they would like to talk about? So I know that I do, and I think Jason does. Is there anybody else?
I have some ideas for a thing that I'm trying to work on, but nothing with code yet. That's not true. There is code, but it's not doing a whole lot yet.
Okay.
I could demonstrate a remote page showing it, but I would have to reboot. it's a to do it, so I don't want to.
Well, that'd be cool to see. Oh, hey Greg. Good to see you. We're just switching to the project portion of the meetup.
Oh, nice.
So.
Yeah, sorry. I was in proto-buff land. Totally spaced the meeting.
No worries. Yeah. Did you have anything that you wanted to show?
I have not done anything since the last one.
Okay. Cool. No problem. Okay. So let's see. I'll just drop a link maybe. Or let's see. Okay. I'll just say, so one of the things that I wanted to talk about was that I have finished my updates for the Scenic Live Reload project that I maintained to support 0.11 in a nicer way. So before, an earlier version of the 0.11 support required you to pass in all the viewport definitions, and then now you don't need to. It reads them it reaches into those ETS tables that Boyd was mentioning. So I would generally recommend that if you're developing, because it just shortens that feedback loop when you're making changes. And let's see so Jason and I have been working on a project more or less together. Maybe I'll give a high level overview of it, and then you can talk about what you've been doing, Jason. Okay, cool. So there is this, actually let me find I can find the link real quick. But there's this cool e-ink display that, I don't have the link. It's a 7-color e-ink display that actually Lars Wilkman at first notified me about, and I have one here that we've been working on. So here's what the display actually looks like without any color currently. And it's just cool because it's 7 different colors. Oh, here's the link.
I just pasted it.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just share. So this is what it looks like if you put an image on it. And so we've been working on adding support for this through Scenic and Nerves. And so it's been a 3-phase project more or less. So it started with Lars, where he ported over the Python code and did an initial version of an Elixir driver for it. But then he ran out of time. And then I started working on it, and I got it to actually draw to the screen using Nerves and Elixir, but I wasn't able to actually draw something from like Scenic, or I was just drawing like rectangles that I was programming manually. And then Jason took it over from there and basically finished it up where you can use Scenic to render to this display, which is just, I think it's really cool.
That is absolutely awesome. Like envious levels of awesomeness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you should buy one.
They appear to be sold out, unfortunately. Otherwise, I would have jumped on it just now.
They are available on Mouser.
Don't tempt my wallet.
Okay, and then you want to talk about your portion of it, Jason?
Sure. I mean, I can't say I really did a lot, but I would say we should give props to, I did some things, but definitely give props to Lars Wickman and Emilio, I don't know how to say his last name, Niari, maybe. They have probably like a handful of years ago worked on the Inky library for the W hat and P hat Inky devices that Pimoroni makes. And I did like a little bit of help back then too, like some of the early get it to draw a screen full of black pixels type of work. But, then I got busy with something else and didn't really help much. So I was excited to get back in for this Inky impression project. And like Jason said, he had it drawing to the screen, and I jumped in and just kind of worked with the Scenic Inky driver. I think I had that backwards. Scenic driver Inky is the name of the repo. Mm-hmm. But yeah, like figured out how to get that actually drawing to the screen and adding in the other colors, because the previous work was only black, white, and an accent color. So getting it to work with 7 was more fun. So yeah, that work is like in PR stage right now. I think it was like over the weekend that it actually got to a point where it was working well enough to show it off. And yeah, hopefully Emilio and Lars will get a look at it soon and be able to push it. I have one here, so I'm going to show you what it looks like. I had a 3D little case printed, and so this is just like a simple, stupid example of the colors printing to the screen. But yeah, it's pretty cool. I would say check it out if you want to. Well, I guess you have to get one of those screens. And like I said, they are available on Mouser. I looked around for a while, and I went ahead and bought one more because I figured as soon as we announce this, they're probably all going to go away. But I would encourage all of you to go get one and play with it, because it's a pretty sweet device. And, you don't have to have a Raspberry Pi to hook up to it, I don't think. But if you do, it certainly helps. Pi Zero is what I used, and I think that it works pretty well.
Yeah, the Pi Zero just mounts on the back of here. So there's like the whatever standard headers there. Oh, there's also buttons on the side, but I haven't played with those yet. But we should be able to get those to work.
Yeah, come to think of it, I don't think we added support for those yet, but it shouldn't be too hard.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then
considering it's e-ink, what does the refresh rate of that screen feel like?
That's a good question.
Slow as hell. Like 25 seconds, maybe something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But the good part is you can remove power, and I've got hope that over the weekend, Philip P from Slack, I almost said Emacs Slack, from the Elixir Slack, was working on the PyJuice 0 with a live book. And I've got one of those here too. And this is like a 1200 milliamp battery. And my hope is that with this thing, we can put the Pi into a deep sleep mode, hit the screen with an image, and then run the whole thing on battery for long enough that the battery can be recharged by a solar panel.
Nice.
River kiosk.
That's super cool.
Yeah, thanks.
I've got to drop that. My quick note is that I can confirm that the Hello World Scenic app does work on FreeBSD. So I'm going to be playing with that. That's me not being able to wait and starting. But take care.
Okay. Good seeing you, Roland. Okay. And then for actually driving the screen, I've created over the past couple of days, I created a small application. And so my first use case is going to be display some quotes that I like on the screen and have it change like every day or so. So I wrote a small application. Let me see. GitHub access in dash. There's an impression dash. So I wrote a small application here called impression dash, and then that uses the uses the Trello API to fetch like a list of quotes that I have on there, and then it displays a different. Well, it doesn't actually. I want to have it like change every day or every hour or something, but I haven't done that portion. But it is able to fetch it. It stores it in SQLite, and then I can change what's displayed. So that's one part. And the other part is I have a fork of Nerd's Livebook that hooks up this Inky impression. And I have that running here. So this is running on this is connecting to the device here. And then I can have like a input. So if I put like, Scenic Meetup here. And then, I'll change the color too. So I put the background color as green. Then I evaluate here. Okay, it should be displaying. It'll take a while to update. And I think when I was doing my work, I was able to have it update within about like 30 seconds. But on the current like branch, it takes like a minute for some reason. So we need to look at why that is. But it'll start to update here. I'll show you when it starts. Yeah, but I like adding a little, what's it called? A little Livebook interface to these sorts of projects. And it's not updating right now.
I haven't tried using Livebook for this yet, but that is really cool. That is really, really cool.
Mm-hmm. And you can use Livebook in host mode too, which I don't have running right now. Okay, it's not updating for some reason right now. If it updates, I'll let you know. Okay. Yeah, Ben, did you want to talk about what you're thinking about?
Yeah, so it's a project that I started a while back and then abandoned. And with the 0.11 updates, I'm glad that I abandoned it a bit. And I say all that to say that 10 was fantastic, but so many things changed. A lot of the things, especially with inputs, and so many things changed that I'm just so glad that I waited. Definitely big improvements. But when I was working on a whiteboard app, I drew, so all the icons, there was a pen icon, color picker, erase, and trash can. I think I did a save icon as well. So all those were drawn with paths. And so I stared at the screen for hours, like, what's that coordinate? That's where I want to go, but I don't know what that coordinate is. So I guess I'll just keep guessing. And then I don't know where I need to go next. So I got them done and scaled them, and that was fine. But I realized after the fact, essentially what I've done in Scenic, nothing practical and nothing valuable. The only things I've done are like, that's annoying. I'm going to go build a thing that fixes that, sort of.
I know what that feels
that was that was the inspiration behind like the layout library was that. So this one is what I realized that I really, really wanted was like a debug mode and a debug app where you can pull in this app and it would render a new viewport for you, and you could get things like scroll around, get the coordinates, the exact coordinates of where your cursor is, so you had a better idea of where you are. You could have a grid overlay, so you could decide like, well, I want 10 by 10 dot grid on the whole thing, so I have an idea of where the hell I am within the whole thing. And then the bigger thing that I actually did get working, it was a disaster, but I did get it working, was being able to output the current graph to another viewport to display it, so you could actually read the text of the graph. So instead of having to IO inspect everything all the time in your command line, the second viewport would actually output the struct, the graph struct, so you could actually read everything that was included. So there were so many times that I was like, where did that thing go? I know that I just put it out there. And so this was the ability to actually see what you have output and what the graph includes. And the goal was that to constantly refresh that app, and then go the other way where you could then edit. So essentially what I'm saying is dev tools, but for Scenic, where you would have your separate things where you could play with the size of things, you could play with the coordinates of things and push it back like push it back to the graph. That would only work in dev mode, but there were so many times where I was like, I need some like debug tools and some like dev tools. So that's the whole inspiration behind that. So I'm working on, I currently have like the target for moving the cursor around. That will include coordinates by the cursor is my plan. So everywhere you go on the screen, the coordinates will be right next to the cursor, so you can know exactly where you are. It's just so important to know, like, where am I in all of this? Boyd and I had talked last, and I realized that there are probably some times where you'd want the coordinates within, right? Like within a group, you want the coordinates that are different than the broader, the local, anyway. So all that's there. Those are all things that I have percolating, and hope to have something. At least my initial goal is the grid. Again, I just think, especially building things like paths or where are you and getting things laid out, just having a dot grid overlay that you can then turn off, I think would be super valuable. So try to get those out when I'm done.
So you're done. As you're talking,
that's really cool.
There's an advantage now with the way the ETS table's laid out. So if you have your little debug screen, you can just reach into the ETS table directly with the ID of the graph you want, and then refer to it in another graph and isolate it and show it that way.
Yep.
Right. You could put a transform on it, blow it up, make it nice and big, zoom in, zoom out.
Yep.
So how would this work? Would this be like a separate driver, or would it just be like a separate viewport that's running at the same time to inspect your main scene?
Yeah. I'm thinking you're going to have to pull it in as a whole separate app, pull it in, and it just works in dev mode. And you'd have to include it. You'd have to add it as a viewport. But then when you push the graph, Boyd, if it makes more sense to go to ETS, but there's also like, you can push the graph that once you push the graph locally, it also goes to debug mode so that you can push it to a couple places.
Okay, I'm brainstorming here. I think what I would do is I would have it be a separate app in the same beam with its own viewport, but you supply a custom driver, the debug driver, which you put into the target app you're going to debug.
Yeah.
So that debug driver can now pull the scripts out of the target viewport, and you're just literally just passing the script over to the debug one, which can then have the local driver in it.
Yeah. So the biggest hurdle one of the really hard things, there's a couple things that I ran into. One was I was using it with the whiteboard app, And when you draw on that, every line you make from when you start to click until you let go, it's just drawing a path constantly. So you have a ton of things being added. Well, because I'm really smart, I made all of those things have IDs that are atoms. And then when you begin to then double that into a second viewport, my machine was like, I'm dying and I'm going to go away now, because I had so many on my machine. So there were a few things I needed to definitely work on. But the whole idea was like, the difficulty was taking a struct, which is Elixir concept, and turning all of those things into text, which is a lot harder than it should have been. And then displaying it in a hierarchical way that also made sense, and displaying it in a way that accounted for all the possible transforms, all the styles, all these different things, where some things are numbers. Well, when you have it displayed as a number over here, it needs to go back as a number, right? It can't come back as a string. So it was a mess, but definitely some work there that I think that I have a better concept, a better idea of how to implement. So, yeah.
Yeah, that would be really helpful.
And I think there's going to be some changes to the layout-o-matic. There's just a few things. There's a lot of cleanup I want to do, some improvements I want to make on how to use it and usability in general. I ended up using it. I forced myself to make sure every app that I built, I use it, because otherwise I'm furthering my own problem of building useless stuff. So the nice thing is that I did build some stuff in for text for the debug, so that I could automatically lay out and have things reflow accordingly when you want to resize a debug screen because it's too big or too small, depending on your graph, making sure all of that can reflow accurately. So yeah, maybe one day eventually, hopefully, guys.
And Ben and I were talking recently, and sometimes people do this pattern where they want to have lots and lots and lots of gem servers that create graphs. And I personally think Scenic is at its best when it's effectively a static piece of UI. And you take some of that layout-o-matic stuff and you actually do that at compile time, right? Developer time. And then the output from it becomes a very, very simple graph, which is fast to load and runs really quickly. Not everything needs to be dynamic at runtime, right? We're not talking about screens where you're not going to take that inky screen and change the aspect ratio at runtime. Right. So that's kind of why the numbers were all baked in up front, is because I didn't want a layout engine. But you do at developer time.
But we do, Boyd.
But you do. But what I think most people really want is, I want that layout engine that I can use, I can move things around, I can get it all right. And then it outputs a term, which is effectively static. And that becomes my graph.
Yeah, and I think that's probably the big change I'll make, where the output makes a lot more sense. It's a lot more dynamic today, and it is, again, theoretical for like a desktop app, which I kept saying. And in my first talk, I pleaded with Boyd, well, maybe we want to use it on the desktop, so quit making me put it on a static screen. So that's a big thing for me, is that we can do it. So why wouldn't we? And there are so many cool tools today, like within the broader Elixir community, that allow us to build the whole app and run it on multiple machines, right? Hand the app off, and we actually have, a poor man's official desktop app that can port to multiple OSs. So that was a thing that I thought was so cool and so unique that I wanted to be able to support, because I think there's a lot of innovation that can happen after that.
I got a brief segue. Sometimes I describe the position of Scenic. There's like different layers and different goals of a UI engine, ranging from, at the high end, here's a video game. Here's Halo, and I'm in this super immersive environment, and it's gorgeous, and it's not latency tolerant. It needs to have high-end hardware, super local, and it renders great. But you need to have a big, expensive piece of hardware, and if it's remote, it's not going to work, or it's not going to work very well, that kind of stuff. In the middle, I have React, I have Flutter, I have things that are kind of pretty. There's lots of animations going on, and I can be somewhat remote. But if you get too remote, then latency comes in and it hurts, and you also need a bunch of processing power. Scenic lives in this kind of lower layer, which is there's not much occupying it, where I want latency tolerance. I want it to run on low-end hardware. I want it to be able to drive that inky screen from a Pi Zero, right? Where you don't necessarily want a big chunk of software that's going. And this, I want it to be, it was aimed at industrial control devices. You can use it to build Windows apps. You can use it to build desktop apps, and there are some advantages to doing it. But at the end of the day, if you really want to do something a little more fancy, there's other options you can choose. Right, so you have to be a little, I've been trying to think, how would you split up the world of UI, and what's the mission Scenic has in life? And it is for repeatable UI that can be rendered and drawn on lots of different devices, and is small and is fast. And at runtime, you give up some of the things like lots of dynamic resizing, but at develop, you put that stuff at developer time. It's why, sometimes people work in animation libraries, and I'm like, yeah, that's cool, and it'll look really neat, and if you're running locally, that'll be fine. But I want to see the day. I'm excited for the day when Scenic is in orbit, where the logical UI is running in orbit, and I'm remoting it down to the Earth. Or I want to see Scenic on a device that's on the moon, and now I've got a couple more than a second of latency on it, but it still runs.
I'm intrigued by that contract you're working on with NASA. Be very cool to see that. I think one of the things that I'm transitioning into a new job somewhere, and so when people ask me why do you use Elixir, and what interests you, and all these recruiters keep telling me it's a niche language, and I'm like, cool, it's not, but cool. Just because you struggle sometimes hiring people does not mean it's a niche language anyway. But one of the things I tell people is how cool it is that you can write firmware code. You can write the code that takes data from a firmware device to the web. It displays it on the web with Elixir code. And then you can also have a UI on the device that's all written in Elixir. So I think that for me, it's one of those cool things to be able to say, you can use live view and you can have the web. And when you're like, well, I don't really want that, having an alternative that's just written in Elixir instead of using Flutter, instead of using the next thing, having something that's written in it, and you have the same engineer that could theoretically write all of that with the same language and the same tooling. That's the thing for me that I'm interested in pushing on. Well, can it go to the desktop, and can I bundle it up and hand it off and start distributing it as a desktop app, and that it doesn't ever connect to the web, right? Like today, there's a lot of people in the industry who, when you say, yeah, and it doesn't even need the web, they're like, yes, I'll take that, please. I'll take 5 of those, because not everyone wants to be connected to the web all the time. So having an alternative that doesn't require that, I think, is such a unique place. And that's why I've continued to push on it. And I'll just continue to be a thorn in your side, Boyd. You're welcome.
All right. So I should be clear. I am not opposed to dynamic layout engines.
I know.
In the local driver, one of the inputs that comes back up to the viewport is when the aspect ratio or the screen size changes. Think of it as, I wanted the base case where it's not installed and it should be an optional add-on. Right. So if I'm building something on a Pi Zero, I don't have to bring in this big engine, but if I want to, I can.
Yeah. Oh, I had another demo that I'd like to show, if nobody else has anything else. Okay. So this is another thing I've been using Scenic for. So I talked about this in my ElixirConf talk a little bit last year, but I have these Govy LEDs, which you can't see behind this paper, that I can control and change the color of via my Nerves devices running Scenic. But trying to always work with an actual device can be very, very annoying, because then you're like shipping code to your Raspberry Pi and rebooting potentially. You can make that a little bit faster, but it's annoying. So I wanted to have like a dev only mode shim, and I decided to do that with Scenic. And because I also want to be able to control multiple devices, so this is a little Phoenix app. And then I hit this add device here, and it's going to create a new Scenic viewport to represent one of the lights. And you can play with it. You can change the color, etc. And there's like the white mode that is broken again. Turn on and off. And yeah, then you have multiple devices, and it just creates multiple different Scenic viewports. And you can control them individually via like, those are messages that are being sent via Phoenix pub sub. So I like it because I'd rather have it be a separate window than like I could do this in like a Phoenix application separately, but it feels more realistic to have it in a separate window, and then I don't have to like open up a new web browser just to see my like UI. So I don't know, just a fun little project.
Awesome.
I like how you're using it as a proxy for the device.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. That makes sense.
Yeah, so as part of it, I created like this struct language of commands to send to the device, that those are interpreted by either by like the Scenic scene or via the actual like Govy library that I have. So I kind of cleaned up the code a bit there too. Some similarities to the drivers that Boyd was talking about earlier.
So you use live view for that?
Yeah, I use live view to render that UI you're seeing. Although it's not very live. There's like a few things that are live in it.
It's cool. I'm curious what the color picker was, because I've messed around with those a bit.
It was like JS. I was looking at JS Color, I think. Yeah.
Just build your own, Jason. It's really a lot of not fun.
It's a good use of time if you really need to learn about it.
It's not. It's not. I promise. I was going to mention I know conf season is upon us for a lot, and I know there's already some happened. I wrote for the 2 talks I've done so far. I did write my slides in Scenic, which also would not recommend procrastinating on doing, because then you find yourself the night before like, I actually have no idea how to do that, and I've never done that before. But I do have that up on my GitHub, and there are a few things. Jason, I think you have opened an issue a while back, and work caused me to not necessarily ignore it, but kind of ignore it. But there are a few things
plenty of issues.
There are a few things that need to get changed. But I'd love to open source that so that people can use it. It just takes, it's a lot of like minor things to update. In my very first talk, I made a change the day of, and it ended up meaning that I forgot to hide all of these primitives as the talk went on. So the talk went on and primitives were added, and they never got erased. So things like that will kind of bite you. But if anybody's interested, I can try to take the time to get those in a good place for people to use.
That'd be cool. Is that a repository that's existing on your GitHub right now?
Yeah, it's layout demo, because I built a demo to show off the layout app, and I was like, I'll just use that to build slides. Guys, none of this was a good idea, but here we are.
Oh, we appreciate it. Oh yeah, here's that issue. I wasn't able to get it to compile or run yet.
Yeah, I think I was using a local, there was a reason that I had to get like the Scenic in the graph, you make the IDs. You present IDs for each thing that are outside of the IDs that you write. And for a reason that I don't remember, I had to access components or primitives by that ID, the Scenic ID, rather than the one that I provided. So I had to have a local copy that unprotected the get by ID in Scenic. So that was the reason that it's not, that it doesn't work, because you have to have that same change. Just remove the P from def P and then it'll work in Scenic. Jason, it's really simple. I'll look over it again and see if I think it probably will be a quicker and easier change. So I'll look over it.
Okay, cool. Yeah, because I'd like to play with your layout-o-matic, but I haven't done that yet.
Don't.
I have a question for Boyd. So, we've heard about changes from .10 and .11 being somewhat turbulent. What do we have in store? Are we reaching some more stability, or what should we expect?
I really think we're reaching some stability. This was a big change, and it's part of why it's been in beta for so long. Put it this way, I don't feel like I can bring it to a 1.0 until I know for certain it works on the new OS. But that is almost upon us. Right? So, but there's been a ton of work on getting the OS up and running. We've got Scenic up and running on it. We've got Beam up and running on it. I can get multiple beams going at the same time. I can relay those things around. I've come to realize that, I was talking about compositing earlier, but composing Scenic UI coming from multiple applications as like the last piece of the puzzle. But that turns out it's actually it's a really minor change. It's additive to the scripting language. I don't have to change anything behind it. So I think we'll get a .11 out, and then hopefully we're getting down to a point where when it's time to add something like an SVG primitive, it's additive. You don't have to go back and change any of the primitives. You don't have to redo things. Thinking through this driver model was a huge change, and there were ripple effects from it that flowed all the way through, like the way you handle inputs flowed through. I had a lot of requests for, hey, can I look at a scene and can I get the size of it? I was thinking about you, Ben, when I added that bit. Like if you have a graph now, there's actually an API you can call which will give you the bounding box that contains it. Right. So there was a lot of.
I'm very excited about it.
Yeah, that was for you, man. And it was a huge pain in the butt because it can contain things that are rotated. So you have an ellipse, by the way. If you have an ellipse and that ellipse is arbitrarily rotated and you want a normalized bounding box for it, I'm really, really hopeful that .11 is the last really disruptive change that has to go in. And it makes sense that it was. The driver model had to change. That flows all the way through. And it just felt like, okay, it's not 1.0 yet. Time to bite the bullet and let's take this one. But it's heading toward 1.0.
Cool. Good to hear.
So what's the first app you're going to build in the new OS? Is it going to be Solitaire or Minesweeper?
The Solitaire of an operating system aimed at devices is a device. It's, everyone builds a weather station, so it's a weather station. You get a little BME 680, you stick it off of I2C, and it's relatively easy. After that, it's an open question if we'll have here's some demo ones that are easy to use and ready to go. But yeah, it's not a phone. The devices we're targeting, they're not for phones and not for PCs. But Scenic can be used on those things. But the OS itself is for industrial control systems. But those have touch screens, and those need to be administered.
So you said you might be able to run Scenic on a phone?
Yeah. But if you want to run the logical UI on a phone, the hard part is getting the beam to run on a phone.
Well, that's been done though, because there's the Elixir desktop project. So that's it's running Elixir via live view or with live view in a desktop application. I think with WX, but he has it also running on devices, on phones, like it is an iOS and an Android app.
It's been a while since I looked at that. It's been a while since in theory, it's just getting a local driver that works on the host OS.
Mm-hmm.
Right. If you could run the Beam, then the Scenic UI part of it is easy. It's getting the driver working on whatever its host OS is. That's the hard part. But even that's not so hard now that the script engine has been standardized up in the viewport.
I don't know if it would be practical, but it'd be cool.
I do have to jump, but I do have a question about the Scenic Framework organization and the contribution organization, and any processes we have or want to have to add things to either of those.
Okay, let's start with, so I did make a Scenic Framework org, and look, I'm really bad at this part of it. Right, so I'm open to suggestions. What's the right time to move Scenic off my personal account and into the org? And getting like a dummy project in that points to it, or I got to figure out how to do all that stuff. And if you guys have experience with it, I wouldn't mind some help and some advice and having it be a smooth transition. This social code GitHub, it's all.
Yeah, I think with 0.11 would be a good time.
That's what I'm thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so
I can help you with that.
I would appreciate that. and the right way to get contributions in, other people are more experienced with running open source projects than I am. And I would happily take that advice.
Jason, you put together the component. Is it the contribution or like component organization or group or something? Yeah.
Scenic, it was like with Scenic Widget Contrib.
Yeah,
Scenic Contrib is the organization.
Okay.
And there's, I'll just share my screen real quick. There's a couple things under that. So right now there's 3. So here's Scenic Contrib, which is just a super basic organization. Yeah. We have a few people helping to manage it. There's a few things under here. So Scenic Examples is a really good one. This is what Chris Ertel has been working on. Mm-hmm. And there's just a bunch of different examples of like using the mouse, using the keyboard, multiple viewports. I think we should add dynamic viewports to here because that was just a little bit annoying to kind of get figured out. So there's a bunch of examples there. There's this one called Scenic Projects, which I could probably call it like Awesome Scenic, but I don't know. They don't want to call it that. So this has like various like notable projects on here. So like Benyer Drawmatic is listed here. There's FlameX by Luke, which he doesn't have a screenshot. I'll ask him to get a screenshot. I have my little asteroids thing, which does have a, and there's like some talks. And then the last one is the Scenic Widget Contrib, which is like a very messy melting pot of various Scenic components. And we haven't really made the top level too good. And there's not a whole lot of stuff you can use in here yet, but there is some things. And then I have a pull request that I'll probably just go ahead and merge that has a few small little drawing utils to make it easier to redraw a component without having to like have a separate draw and a separate like graph.modify call. It's probably a little bit not as like efficient if you're trying to minimize what gets sent over the wire, but it makes it a little bit nicer to render. And also like I have a little helpers to just like update a graph that I store within the scene assigns, as well as like an assign and push graph helper function. So I can just have my separate state kind of like 0.11, but I like that sort of pattern. I like a pattern with a struct for my state. So I just have a single assign that's a state. I have a state and graph, so 2 assigns.
Jason, I reused that pattern because I was like, I'll just do all these assigns. And I was like, no, I don't need to rewrite every single thing that I've written. So just storing the state in a state is I think a nice pattern, especially for coming from older stuff.
Yeah.
Cool. I have some things like the color pickers and the icons that I drew, and I'd like to add those in and continue a whole icons thing that I've been working on.
That'd be great.
So I'll try to work through those and try to make sure that you can do things like scale them appropriately. I think that's going to be kind of the hard thing. But yeah, I'll try to add in what I've basically got today.
Thank you. That'd be great.
Jason, you're talking about multiple viewports for a second there. Have you guys played with multiple drivers in the same viewport?
I have not.
It's lots of fun. You'll notice that the driver is a list. It's not a single. So you could put like 2 copies of the local driver in there. Just don't give them the same name. You put 2 copies of the local driver in one viewport. You get 2 screens that mirror the same content. Right, so you can open different windows.
Oh, actually, I did that by accident when I was trying to do the dynamic viewports.
And it'll make more sense once the remote one starts actually working, because it means you can have the local one up, and you can have the remote one up, and you can set one up as read only, so you can monitor what's going on.
Yeah, no, that's cool. Okay. Any last closing thoughts? If not, I think we can go ahead and wrap up.